All right, y'all. So Barbara Lee, who's running for the U.S. Senate seat in California, Dianne Feinstein's old seat, she made some news because she had quite a policy proposal. This went kind of viral here. I'm going to play it for you. I guess this is in one of the debates, and then we'll react to it.
You're calling for a $50 an hour federal minimum wage. That's 7 times the current national minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. Can you explain how that would be economically sustainable for small businesses? You have 60 seconds.
First, let me say I owned and ran a small business for 11 years. I created hundreds of jobs. Benefits, retirement benefits, also healthcare benefits. I know what worker productivity means, and that means that you have to make sure that your employees are taken care of and have a living wage. In the Bay Area, I believe it was the United Way, came out with a report that very recently, $127,000 for a family of 4 is just barely enough to get by. Another survey very recently, $104,000 for a family of 1. Barely enough to get by. Low income because of the affordability crisis. And so just do the math. Just do the math. Of course, we have national minimum wages that we need to raise to a living wage. You're talking about $20, $25, fine. But I have got to be focused on what California needs and what the affordability factor is when we calculate this wage.
All right, so there's a few things to say about this. Is that, okay, the response most people will have immediately when they see this is like, okay, is that really possible? Like, is that possible to have that high of a minimum wage? Well, look, coming from somebody who is solidly on the left, I will say, no, I don't think it's possible. For this very simple reason. People make the claim, oh, if you raise the minimum wage, that's going to lead to an increase in unemployment. Because if business owners have to pay their workers more, if they can't afford it, they're going to have to lay off some of the workers, basically. That's the argument. Now, look, all of the studies that I've seen to this point, when they look into this, is that there actually hasn't been an increase in unemployment when you have an increase in the minimum wage, okay? So if it's, let's, for argument's sake, let's make up some numbers here. The federal minimum wage is $7.25. Let's say a place has a $10 an hour minimum wage in a certain state, and they decide we're going to raise it to 15, but we're going to do it in different increments. So every year we're going to increase it by $1 until we get to 15. So if it's 10 now, the next year it'll be 11, year after that it'll be 12, year after that it'll be 13, year after that it'll be 14, then 15, and then it stays at 15, okay? In a scenario like that, it hasn't led to an increase in unemployment. Why? Because you're making advancements in the minimum wage, and you're doing it at a pace and a clip that is possible for even the small businesses to be able to afford. Look, are there some giant corporations that can afford to pay colossally higher minimum wage? Absolutely. But there's also a lot of small businesses that genuinely can't afford it. So here's the point I'm trying to make. Because of small businesses, I actually don't think it'd be possible to do a minimum wage that high without a massive increase in unemployment. Because every small business, let's say they have 5 employees, if you raise the minimum wage to $50 an hour, they'll, you know what, I'll get by with 2, right? I'm gonna lay off 3 of them because I just can't afford. I'll get by with 1 other, and I'll have to pick up more of the slack and do more of the work myself if I'm a business owner, right? I definitely think that would happen in a scenario where you raise it that much. Now, again, to be clear, the studies show if you raise it in a reasonable manner to a reasonable number, that doesn't happen. There isn't an increase in unemployment because you're raising it to a level that businesses can afford. But now let me go a step further. So I don't actually agree with her on this. In my opinion, what you could do is either do, $15 an hour, fight for 15, like everybody says, national minimum wage, $15 an hour, or I think a better idea is what's called sectoral bargaining, which is basically everybody's unionized and you do it by sector of the economy. And what we've seen, for example, is that like fast food workers in California are now, they now do sectoral bargaining. So you kind of set a wage across an entire industry. And in a scenario like that, you tend to get the best possible number without having other negative economic consequences associated with it. So I think sectoral bargaining is better. I'm actually okay with the idea of raising the minimum wage to a higher number than 15, let's say like $20 an hour, as long as you have programs in place that can subsidize small businesses that can't afford to pay that higher number. So you can subsidize them so they can keep those workers on. So there's a number of different ways to do this that I would support. I also like the idea of doing a living wage instead of doing it at the, at the federal level, like, oh, the whole country is $15 an hour. You could do a living wage by county or region or state, where it's literally a different number depending on where you live. So if you live in New York City, it might be $26 an hour because that's what you need to literally afford to live there. In Wyoming, it might be $11.57 because that's, what a living wage is over there. So there's a bunch of different ways to do this. I think her policy is too ambitious. Now, having said all that, my biggest issue with what was said here is actually not what Barbara Lee said. It's not. My biggest issue is everybody's reaction to what she said. Because, pretty much across the board, what an idiot. What a dumbass. Pay workers a lot more. Impossible. Stupid. And it's like, hold on now. What's more egregious and more stupid and more idiotic and more absurd is what we're doing right now, where the minimum wage is $7.25 an hour federally. We are nowhere near a living wage. So people work full time and they don't make enough money to survive. They can't afford the basics, even though they work full time. So this is not an issue of like, try harder. No, they're trying. And the system just doesn't allow them to live even a bare minimum comfortable existence. So just to give you a fact to back this up here, a full-time minimum wage job won't get you a one-bedroom apartment anywhere in America. So this says how many hours you'd have to work at minimum wage to afford a one-bedroom apartment. In New York, you'd have to work 98 hours a week at minimum wage to afford a one-bedroom apartment. Pennsylvania, 78 hours. Virginia, 97 hours. I mean, even on the lower end, look, Nebraska, 54 hours. And that's Nebraska, okay? California, 92 hours. Texas, 73 hours. In other words, the minimum wage is way too low. We have Republican politicians who are not only okay with the current minimum wage, they don't want a minimum wage. They don't want one at all. So you want to go back to a scenario where, people could get paid $4 an hour or $5 an hour, have no labor protections whatsoever. There's a negotiation between employer and employee, and they act like it's equal power in the scenario, and everybody's a total willing participant, and like you're going to get to a fair number that way. Nonsense. One person in that equation has all the fucking power, obviously, right? To me, the status quo is more absurd and more ridiculous and more idiotic and more brutal than what she's talking about. But everybody's making fun of her. I don't see very many people making fun of, like, literally all of the Republicans who are not in favor of raising the minimum. None of them are in favor of raising the minimum wage. None of them. Even to something like $12 an hour, which would still not be a living wage. So I guess that's the thing that annoys me, is the imbalance here and how this is talked about. You have somebody who comes out with a proposal, which, look, admittedly, it's overreaching. Now, it's fair to say it's overreaching. I don't think she understands the total economic ramifications of doing something like she floated here. I think that's a fair point. But like the mocking and the jeering in response to what she said, meanwhile, it's way more loathsome and way more brutal and way more vicious to defend the status quo and defend what we have going on right now. And, I just think people need to keep that in perspective, right? So just to go through some of the replies here. That California weed got her high as fuck. Quickest way to cause massive inflation. Absolutely ridiculous. Why do they want hyperinflation? This will solve poverty all over the world. Why didn't anyone think of this before? Tell me you don't understand economics without telling me you don't understand economics. Would you like fries with that hamburger and Coke? That'll be $61.20. Like I said, it's like almost everybody here is mocking it and making fun of it. And like I told, I don't actually agree with the specifics here, and I gave you what my policy preference is. But it's just like, I guess what frustrates me more is she gets more heat for saying something like this, proposing a minimum wage that's too high, than anybody does for wanting to keep the minimum wage the same or not have a minimum wage. And that drives me crazy because the system that we have right now absolutely crushes people, man. It crushes people. It's totally unfair. It's totally unjust. I mean, we've gone through the numbers before, but if the minimum wage kept up with just what it was in equal relative terms to like the 1960s, it would be over $10 an hour today. If it kept up with productivity, it would be over $20 an hour today. Like, all these facts just sort of lay bare how brutal and grotesque and disgusting the current system is. And people have just like passively accepted the brutality of the current system. And instead of mocking that and making fun of that, it's, hey, the ambitious politician who's overreaching, let's make fun of her first and foremost. I just find the misplaced priorities are absolutely insane to me. Absolutely insane to me. So, look, I told you what my policy preferences are here, but I will say this. At least somebody is seemingly, at least in theory, trying to care about working people, which almost never happens in our politics.
Hey, y'all, do me a favor and like and subscribe. It helps out big time in the algorithm. Click the bell as well for notifications when videos drop, and watch that video on screen right now. You know you want to.